Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on Brattleboro Community Television, as well as Emily's YouTube channel. So, hey, it is 2021. I want to welcome all new and returning listeners to the first show of our third season.
Oh my goodness.
Can you believe it?
I cannot actually. I'm so glad to be doing this with you. And the third season, that's incredible.
It is. There feels something magical about that, number 3.
Yeah,
so
you really know a show's going to last for a while when it gets to the third season, right?
Yep, you're like, okay, it's got legs.
Yep, and it has a steady fan base. I don't know if that's true for us, but
I don't know either. But we keep showing up, which is how you get things done.
Absolutely.
And so folks who
especially in small town democracy.
That's the only way things get done, is people show up. So welcome, regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, representative for the town of Brattleboro, and newly sworn in as of Wednesday to your second biennium.
Indeed. Thank you.
Applause. I have to say, it was really sweet and touching to see the number of Windham County lawmakers who are friends with me on Facebook putting up the photo of them swearing in at their desks. It was just like, oh, democracy continues despite all the in the world. And DC.
It really does. It's very, sometimes it's so peaceful as to be a little bit boring up here, but I would take that over the other thing any day of the week.
Yes. Which I would like to just take a moment to touch in with both of us, because even though our show is very Vermont based and the work that we do tends to be very Vermont based, Vermont, as much as it tries, is not an island. And as much as it tries, it's not a universe unto itself. And we are impacted by things that happen elsewhere in the country and the world. And so as a lawmaker who is, embarking on a new session in a pandemic, in the transition of power from one president to the next, not smooth power transition, but, how are you doing? How are you feeling? What are you thinking about right now?
What happened with the terrorist insurgency, essentially, in Washington is scary, yes. What it revealed in terms of how easily folks were able to get into the Capitol building, what that means about sort of either the complicity of Capitol Police or the level of organization and preparation that group was able to engage in without other flags being raised, red flags being raised, not Trump flags being raised. It's all really scary, and it all tells a much longer, wider story. And so I, as someone who's prone to be scared of fascism at every turn, I was expecting this. I was expecting more than this weeks ago. I think we've talked a little bit about Masha Gessen's work before, but this is what we knew was going to happen, because we've spent 4 years either looking the other way or supporting it or complicit in some way with the rise of white supremacy all across the country and all across the world, including in Vermont. And there were Vermonters who went down on the buses.
Yeah. And
I'm curious how we're going to hold those folks accountable in their communities. And I'm curious how we're going to hold folks who haven't, spoken out yet accountable for what's happened. And so for me, at the end of the day, sort of adrenaline aside and deep empathy for the folks who work down there and the terror they experienced. I'm, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, Olga, but I really, this has been a year of so much being revealed to so many people.
Mhm.
And as more becomes revealed, we're able to act on more and we're able to solve more problems. And at least here, rather than with COVID or, incredible health disparities with people of color, it's a discrete number of people who have died. And I mourn each of those losses, but
Mhm.
we have so much work to do.
Yeah.
And just because, and I'm very confident that Biden is going to be sworn in and we are going to have a transition of power. You can see people fleeing the ship now that, now that things have been so firmly revealed. But the work isn't going to stop there.
Mhm.
And we can't let it stop there. And we can't stop organizing and talking and really doing like real work,
Mhm.
not just to hold people accountable in a real restorative, transformative way, but also to prevent the further rise of white supremacy, which is something that other countries have done very successfully all over the world. You can counter domestic extremism with really good, progressive social and political programs. But it's work you need to be mindful of and focus on, and not just, because you have someone who's kind and patient and cares about the rule of law at the highest office, just assume everything's going to be okay. So I guess I feel like we're right in the middle of the work right now.
Mhm. Thank you, Emily.
Mm-hmm.
I have been, the irony for me is when all this was happening in DC, I was actually working through the more than 200-page community safety review report that has just come out of the Safety Review Committee in Brattleboro, looking at how the town deploys its resources for community safety and who feels safe in the community and who does not. And as I'm working my way through this report, I get a text from a friend in London saying, "What the heck is this? This is full on dictatorship," was, I think, his text. So I was, what? And, off I go to the news sources. And I think what I've been sitting with is similar to you, Emily. But I was really sitting with, as a journalist, when I see these things unfold, even though it's not Windham County based, it's like, if I need to write something about this or impart something to the community, how am I going to make it meaningful? And how am I going to make it useful? So I was sitting with that and and this is, I don't have an answer to, but also as a journalist, feeling that part of my duty is to support people's right to assemble and their right to protest and their right to the First Amendment, regardless of whether I like what they're saying or not. And yet, what happened in the Capitol is not okay with me. And so sitting with like, okay, so how do I balance those two things as a professional and an individual? And I admit I don't have an answer yet. I am still sitting with them.
Well, I mean, yeah. Sorry, continue.
Oh no, but like you, I feel that what happened, I felt really frustrated with everyone saying, well, we need to call the 25th Amendment. We need to impeach him again. And my frustration was, why did it take this long to get to this point? We should have done this like 4 years ago. And so I think for me, what I'm feeling is, just like the pandemic did not in many ways create new problems, it just, as you said, revealed them. And so, yeah, what Trump is not in a vacuum.
No.
And what comes next is that's what we need to keep asking ourselves better questions so we can create better policy and stronger, healthier communities. And nip things in the bud sooner rather than later.
There was people there who were wearing like, the line on Twitter where everything is snarky was like, they had merch, but like there was, people wearing professionally printed sweatshirts that said like insurrection, January. I'm sorry, I have no idea what today's date is or what yesterday's date was or the date. Whatever the date was that we're talking about. I'm so embarrassing. That just happened. Really killed my story. But, like the date, and it said insurrection, and it was like, with a guy with a gun, like on the sweatshirt. Like this was not spontaneous. And I think in a lot of ways, the difference between protest and a sit-in and a rally and what terrorism is guns.
Yeah. And violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, sweetie.
Yeah. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the resolution that we passed yesterday in the House condemning the acts, but I can wait a moment on that if you have more to say.
I think the last point I was going to make is what I found interesting too was, for me, I tend to draw a line on violence. Like it kind of stops being a protest, an assembly, or a sit-in when violence and fear are used, which is perhaps an arbitrary line for me, but it's my line. But I think the other thing that surprised me is we don't know how many Trump supporters were working in the Capitol that day. And it makes me wonder, like, how many people, despite their job, might have been to do something else, like protect the Capitol. They didn't do it.
Yeah.
And that is very uncomfortable for me. And it's probably a wussy uncomfortable, but it's an uncomfortable all the same.
No, I mean, I read a lot of science fiction. I have my whole life. And especially like future present fiction is, but
it's a good genre.
It's a great genre. But, the ideas around, when we mix that with our understanding of, how fascism rises or how coups happen, that's why I say we're sort of at the middle of the journey, because what it took to get here was a very long, deep misinformation campaign to bring all of those people along who work throughout, federal government, Vermont. We just had a state trooper who was removed from his post because he was sort of, part of this conversation, complicit in it. And it takes a long time to convince someone to sort of go against their oath of office or their obligations to justice or peace or whatever, whatever a federal employee signs up for. And so, yeah, there were so many other turning points that we could have found. And I guess I'm sad it took this long, but I'm hopeful that maybe now we are at one. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no going back.
No. I hope not.
Yes. So please take a moment to talk about the resolution that the House passed it, and has it gone on to the Senate?
It's going to the Senate today.
Okay. And it passed like 130 to 16, isn't it?
It did. Well, so yes. So it's a resolution, and usually a resolution such as this, people sign on to. And so those 113 people signed on to the resolution. a weird sort of trick of our new virtual procedure is that when we vote electronically, it's considered the equivalent of a voice vote. But because of the way Zoom works, if we all did a voice vote, it would take it would be 5 minutes of yeses, and the no's, it wouldn't work. Because we can't become a chorus. If you've ever tried to sing with anyone on Zoom, it's never works.
Yeah.
So it's technically a voice vote. It wasn't sort of 100 and whatever to whatever. It was, it passed is really what it is, procedurally. But yes, there were some people who did not sign on to the resolution, and I think that's really important. And it was quite explicit. Do you want me to read it? It's not very long.
I think you should.
Is that interesting? Okay.
Yeah.
Whereas on January 6th, 2021, President Donald J. Trump addressed thousands of supporters, urging them to go to the Capitol in support of his false claim that he won the 2020 presidential election. And whereas the president's supporters marched to the Capitol and violently stormed the building, attacking police officers, ransacking offices, terrorizing the members of Congress, and forcing the stoppage of the certification of President-elect Biden's electoral victory, and 4 people died as a result of the violence. And whereas the actions of this mob were not just criminal and lawless, they constitute a direct attack upon our democracy. And whereas this attack was instigated by President Donald Trump, who is attempting to overturn the results of a fair and free election that he lost in order to keep himself in power. And whereas Governor Phil Scott forcefully stated that the fabric of our democracy and the principles of our republic are under attack by the president, and called for President Trump to resign or be removed from office now, therefore be it. That the General Assembly condemns the storming of the US Capitol on January 6, 2021 as an attack on democracy, and be it further that the General Assembly calls for President Donald J. Trump to resign or be removed from office by his cabinet or by the Congress, and be it further resolved that the Secretary of State be directed to send a copy of this resolution to President Donald J. Trump, Vice President Michael Pence, and the Vermont congressional delegation.
Thank you.
Yes. And so we voted on that without debate, which I think is a really interesting thing.
Yeah. Yep.
So usually if people have strong feelings about things, they want a chance to say them. I think that's true of normal humans, but it's particularly true of politicians. And there was, and a number of Republicans signed on to this, clearly, and some didn't. And all the progressives did, and all the independents did, I believe. I haven't actually counted them. But by not debating, I think we sent a very strong message that this is just true, right? And that's very powerful. And we sent a very strong message that we don't want to hear from the voices of people who, this isn't a time to hear the voices of dissent. There's another time for that, and it's not now. And that we stand together. But I worry that it's also, quite frankly, a way of papering over or being complicit in the ways that we are complicit here in Vermont, and another opportunity for sort of Vermont exceptionalism to stand in the way of doing the work. So what we did in some ways is we allowed the folks who didn't sign on, by not having a roll call, by not debating, we allowed the folks who don't agree with this to stay in the shadows. And it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing. We also didn't give them a platform.
Right.
And so I'm not saying all of that to say that I disagreed with the way we did it. I just, there are pros and cons to everything. And I think it's worth naming
Yes.
the dynamics of what happened.
Well, and I think it's worth naming that even though this step was taken and it may have been a powerful step, it's only a step. And it can't be like, okay, we did our part, moving on. It's only a part of the work. I appreciate what you said about Vermont exceptionalism, because we're good at that. But also, I think we as humans, one of our problems is that sometimes we define ourselves by what we're not.
Yes.
And we say, well, we're not DC, so we're fine.
Yes.
And it's like, well, just because we're not DC doesn't mean we're fine. We still have our own stuff to do and take accountability for and change. And I think I just want to name that we have to be so careful when you have such a huge flashpoint at DC right now and such a huge example, that we don't just become complicit ourselves and be like, well, we're not that.
Yeah.
So it's fine.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Staying with the legislative session and moving on from that resolution, what does it feel like right now? I know there are some lawmakers who are like, we need to focus on COVID and just COVID. And some lawmakers are like, nope, let's file these bills and keep moving. What's the kind of sense in the legislature right now about next steps in regards to DC, in regards to pandemic, in regards to what Vermont just needs to get done?
Yeah. So just mechanically, which I think is really important for people to understand, that sort of the mechanics of virtual legislating are different. And so they have limitations and benefits to them. We've talked about the benefit that everyone can watch everything we do. But yesterday, for example, when we were going between joint sessions and floor sessions and trying to have committee meetings, there were just like this constant flow of different Zoom links that we all had to be navigating, with times changing. And is it the same Zoom? Like it was chaotic and confusing, and very different from you're walking into the House chamber and someone reminds you that you're supposed to be in room 11, like, because there's no one to remind you when you're like digging for the right Zoom link. And all of that, it just makes things less efficient. And democracy is not efficient to begin with. So,
which in some cases is a strength, and in some cases is just a cluster. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Again, you know, pluses and minuses to the inefficiency of democracy. But so we are not going to be able to get done as much as we want to get done, just because of sort of the mechanics of how long things take and confusion. It takes us longer to vote on anything because we use this electronic system. It takes us a little bit longer to debate things because there's always like, can you hear me? You're still muted, you know? So there's all of that. There's also people, you know, we've talked about this before, people struggle to act courageously when outside of sort of social context, which is very reasonable, again, and human. And so pushing really hard legislation is probably not going to happen this year, because the conversations are sort of softer, that round the edges of that difficulty aren't available.
And when you're saying softer conversations, you're meaning conversations that might happen over a cup of coffee or in the hallway of the State House.
Or even just like a look between people in a public forum that helps just like someone know that someone else is with them while they're doing the hard thing.
Okay.
And so without that sort of, and, you know, like party caucuses are a very strange beast, but what they mean for a lot of people is that you have a team that's with you that's working on this thing. So if even if you're scared or hesitant to sort of act courageously in this one way, you know that you have all these other people with you who are going to have your back if you do it.
Mhm.
And so, but that's really, it's hard to sort of have that as a felt experience, I think, when you're
Mhm.
legislating from your, computer inside your house.
Right.
Um, so there are those things. And there's also, Vermonters generally don't like change. Um, and there's so much change happening so rapidly right now.
Mhm.
And so I think there's a hesitancy to jump in the mix and say, I want more change. Let's change more things right now. Right. Um,
Right.
and so I think that a lot of us are saying like, oh, there's enough happening. We shouldn't rock the boat more. Um, and so like one example of that is like a lot of most of the committee chairs stayed the same, even though we had a new speaker and we have a new pro tem, just as an example.
Yeah,
So
I thought that was interesting.
um, that said, we can't just do COVID relief,
Mhm.
partly because all of the committees are still meeting every day.
Mhm.
And so they're going to
They
do
got stuff
things
to
with their
do.
time. They have stuff to do. We also can't like lose 2 years on, climate change or
Mhm.
employment law or a whole host of things that like Vermonters need action 10 years ago on. Democracy is
Right.
slow. We can't just like give up 2 years to it. Um, we've
Yeah.
lost so much in this last year. We can't lose momentum on every issue we care about as well.
I would also add, since COVID actually, as we have said so many times on this show, did not cause new problems, it
Mhm.
just highlighted where we had weaknesses.
Yes.
We can't afford to keep those weaknesses around in case there's another fill in the blank.
So, and that's the thing. When someone says we're only going to focus on COVID relief, that means very different things to different people. Very, very
Mhm.
different things to different people. So from my perspective, if we're only going to focus on things related to COVID, I think we could do everything on like my entire agenda, on many of my colleagues' entire agendas. But that includes like climate change legislation and a bunch of workers' rights and employment law issues and fixing the childcare problem and family medical leave. And like, those are all deeply COVID related issues from my perspective.
Mhm. So we have to go to break here in just like a minute, but I want to ask you, Emily. So one thing that just occurred to me is when now I know Tropical Storm Irene is a very different disaster
Mhm.
than COVID. However, the conversation that Shumlin, former Governor Shumlin, pushed during Irene is resiliency
Mhm.
and building things back stronger and more resilient. And I think that did have some positive changes in some of the infrastructure that we installed after Tropical
Mhm.
Storm Irene. But one thing I don't think I've heard, and maybe I've just missed it, is that conversation around resiliency and COVID.
Mhm.
I haven't heard that. Is it happening and I just missed it? Or is it just not part of the conversation this time?
It's certainly not what the governor is leading with.
Okay. That's
Um,
kind of where I was going.
yeah. And maybe when we come back from the break, we can talk about sort of the remarks, the State of the State address, and then the responses from the House and Senate about that.
Fantastic. That's what we shall do. Stay tuned, everyone. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment.